This is The Right Approach. I'm JW Judge, and with me, as always, is my co-host Barbara Hinsky. This is a podcast for writers. To learn more about the craft of writing as we explore a new topic every week, our guest today is Jennifer Hilt. She has written several books about tropes, which is what we're going to talk mostly about today. She also has a series about the undead detective. Jennifer, welcome to the show, first of all.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Are you familiar with James Scott Bell's series about zombie legal thrillers?
No, but I have to check that out. That
Okay.
sounds really
When I
cool.
saw The Undead Detective
Uh-huh.
a couple months ago, I think is when I first came across it. I was like,
Yeah.
oh man, there is some sort of crossover here between undead detectives and zombie lawyers that needs to be
Yeah.
explored.
I have like a secret fantasy about being a medical examiner, and being a vampire medical examiner was just like the best thing I could think of in terms of escapism. So I went with that.
I love it. Yeah, so my wife is a nurse, and
Oh.
and her mother is a nurse, so there are no unexplored medical topics in our house. So
Mhm.
that sounds good. Well, let's start with a segment where we talk about what's going on either in the writing or publishing side of our author businesses. And I'll just start with mine because I'm pretty pumped about it. I am a chapter and a half away from finishing the first draft of my fourth novel. Um,
Wow, that's great.
December has been
Congratulations.
very productive so far. And yesterday I was working on it, and I was working on like the climactic chapter,
Ooh.
and it wasn't landing right.
Mhm.
And so, and I could just tell. And but I kept going and kept going, and then I reorganized just the delivery of that chapter.
Mhm.
And I was like, oh yeah, this just feels way better. And so as soon as I finish this the draft, which hopefully will be tomorrow, maybe Wednesday, I will send it off and to my alpha reader, and she will hopefully have good things to say. And if not, we'll make further changes. And then when I keep up with a daily like word count, and my goal this year was 100,000 words, which I hit in the fall. And yesterday, when I finished writing and put it into the spreadsheet, I noticed that I'd gone over 150,000 words for the year. So
Fantastic.
I was I was pretty excited about that. So um, whoever wants to pick it up next, feel free.
Well,
Barbara?
I'll just jump in just to say that's so incredible because you also have a hugely busy day job as a trial lawyer. So that's remarkable. You should be, I'm so proud of you.
Well, thank you.
I'll take a minute to brag on you. Um, so I've sent the fourth book in my Guiding Emily series is in proofreading now. And a week ago Sunday, I typed my two favorite words, the end, on the first draft of my ninth book in my Rosemont series. I'll be doing some editing of that today, but feeling in good shape for next year, and done some business planning and cleaning out some files. And I've always said I want to take the last 2 weeks of the year off, and I'm going to do it this year. So it'll be fun. So that's kind of what I've got going on. And Jennifer, what have you got
That
to
sounds
share?
great. I've been doing some file cleaning too. I love the whole like tidy, get stuff all organized and stuff like that. My brain's kind of been on fire because I went to 20 books in Vegas, which is like this really big conference in early November. And there's just a lot of really interesting ideas and all these people doing really cool things. So I've been thinking a lot about those things. And I'm also in edits of finishing my next book, which is the romance Trope Thesaurus. And I'm starting to fiddle with a mystery thriller one, because my favorite part is kind of the drafting idea generation. So it's just nice to like have fresh things to think about while I'm working on edits. And let's see, I think that's pretty much those things. They'll come out in the spring, and yeah, I think that's about it.
Well, this will
Wow.
be a good conversation because Barbara writes romance with crime elements to it. I
Mhm.
write dark fantasy that veers into horror occasionally, and I read your horror trope thesaurus book. So let's start with defining our terms. And so that we know what we're talking about, because I think trope is a word that has a lot of connotations to a lot of people, and I think sometimes that word carries a lot of weight. So let's start with, when you're talking about tropes, Jennifer, what are we talking about?
I totally agree about the different meanings of tropes. I just wanted to say, and really the emotional baggage that comes with them. And I noticed that when I was helping other writers plot, that we were like needing these story elements to talk about, but they were like hesitant to use tropes. And so that made me think like, well, what is a trope? And why is it important yet nobody wants to use it and all that? So that was how I kind of went down this rabbit hole of exploring it. But I came up with the definition that a trope is a building block for stories, and it's a universally understood concept. So a relationship. So you have like orphan, everybody knows what that is, or enemies to lovers, or antagonists. Like those are just like main ideas that we can use to then build our story and make it specific to our world. And I discovered and go like just looking at so many books and stories. I mean, everything has tropes. Some are better developed than others. And I think that's why there'll be people that are like, oh, I don't want to use tropes. And I felt like it was important to make a distinction between tropes and cliches, because I feel like a trope is a very neutral, workable concept, where I feel like cliches are just like fixed and derogatory, and it doesn't help move a story forward. So that was kind of like how I have differentiated them. But it's just interesting because I saw some posts today on Facebook, and people were talking about, oh, I hate tropes. I never want to use them in my stories. And I didn't want to get into it. It was somebody else's thing, but I was like, yeah, but you're already using them. They're already there. It's just a matter of trying to use them better. So
Yeah. And I use Reddit fairly regularly, and on the fantasy readers and writers subreddits, there will be people talking all the time about like, what are your most hated tropes? And I think when they say tropes in that context, a lot of times I think it has more to do with cliches than the
mhm.
story conventions.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, fantasy is packed with tropes. I mean, completely packed. It's just, yeah.
so why do tropes, well, I guess there's two questions, and I'm not sure what to ask, which order to ask them in. Why
Yeah.
do they matter to readers?
Mhm.
And why did they then have to matter to authors?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, what I really discovered with all this reading and thinking about it was tropes are relationships. I mean, what we really want in stories are to be taken into somebody else's life and have this experience. And I think readers instinctively recognize that about tropes, that they are relationships, but it comes upon us to make them fresh and unique. But if we had to, like, every story we created, we had to start from scratch with explaining how the world works and how, just basic things, we would never get anywhere. So we need to start from like a central base, and from that we can build our unique world. But we need to like hook the reader in with some things that are like, okay, understandable, and okay, I'm curious, I want to go on that. I'll give an example. I'm reading Babel. Have either of you guys heard about that? It's a fiction, a fantasy, and it's getting a lot of press as like one of the best fantasy books of the year. And it's just fantastic. It's about an orphan in Oxford in the 1830s, and he's basically a linguist, training to be a linguist with a bunch of other kind of kids that have mysterious backgrounds. So it has all these kind of things like, oh yeah, we kind of know what those concepts are, but this author has created such a unique and absorbing world that it's basically all I want to do is go back and read that book. I don't want to do anything else today, really, except talk to you guys. But but I mean, it's just when I'm reading it, it's like, oh, I can see this person's used tropes, but it's only because I've been looking at them for a long time, but they're so developed, I don't ever feel like, oh God, this is the same story I've read a million times.
So This is so interesting. Tell us about, first of all, you've got a series of thesauruses. So tell us what you've got, what the new one is, and how you decided to put your knowledge and your research together in these helpful thesauruses.
Oh, thanks. Well, I wrote the Trope Thesaurus, and that came out last January. And honestly, I just wanted to write that because it was just, I was just really interested in looking at tropes in a way that wasn't, as we like talked about, negative or derogatory. And I just thought, but what if they aren't? What if there's more that can be done with them instead of just dismissing them? Because a lot of very successful genre authors know how to use them. They're in their keywords, they're in their blurbs, and those things really work. So I spent I think I spent almost a year writing it. I really went down a rabbit hole, and that released, and I've really enjoyed talking to people about it and just kind of getting feedback and learning different ways that they use tropes. And then I wrote the horror one mostly because the Trope Thesaurus doesn't have a horror element in it. And I have liked to read some horror books, but I don't consider myself like an expert on that genre. So this was like a way that I could just like go and like look at every possible thing that was kind of interesting to me. And the biggest thing to me that I learned that I didn't know was that the horror genre is totally about relationships. And that was like making me think about that. I just didn't, I would have never guessed that. I thought, sure, the dread and the shock and, all those kind of things. But what makes those elements work are the relationships. It's not just like slasher films. And even the slasher films, the first in series, I discovered at least, are very relationship focused. And that was just fascinating to me. So I have those two out, and I'm working on a romance one. I'm finishing that up right now. And then, like I said, I'm starting the mystery thriller one, which is super fun because I get to like think about all the books and movies. And I don't know, it's just that's just like the fun part of like, okay, what am I going to talk about?
So in your own process, I mean, is there a point, at what point do you start actively or consciously thinking about tropes and reader expectations, whether that's in the initial writing stages or coming back to it? How does that affect your own writing process?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely think the reader expectations and the genre expectations are super important to know. And in a way, and I think they're separate than tropes, because I think you can use basically all the tropes in all the genres, but just you have to be aware of what the reader's expectations are. I don't feel like there's like really specific, some more than others. Like in romance, you're going to have more like bride and those kind of things. But in general, I think the story elements can be used across stories. For me, what I've started to do, and I'll help like my friends plot, and I have some clients, and I'm just kind of generally my mind's always thinking about a story. I've started this thing of where I try to use like at least three tropes for each main character, and then think about like three tropes of what kind of relationship they're going to have. Like, is it going to be, like I said before, like there's enemies to lovers, and something like enemies to lovers, that's not just one thing. That's going to break down into a whole series of scenes that get you through that transformation. So then thinking about, okay, so what tropes can be packed in there to help with that journey? So that's been fun to try that out on my stuff and my guinea pig friends to work on. And I'm co-writing a mystery series with my brother, and we're using, he's kind of first drafting it, and then I'm going in and like, okay, what if we put these tropes in and pull them like all the way through the series, or use them to specific books? So I think they can be used multiple ways. They can be used to build a story, but then I also think you can go back if you just like need to draft without thinking so critically about it, and then add them in where you feel like, okay, I need to know more about these characters or their relationships. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Barb, I'm curious, in your writing process, and then, I know we've just done a couple of episodes with your writing coach. Is there a point in the writing where y'all are actively discussing these types of things, or are they just kind of inbuilt into the work you're doing?
I think at this point in these series, it's more inbuilt. There's no form, we don't have a formalized process to discuss it in this way, but for sure, my work, like all work, is full of tropes. It has to be. That's how we tell stories.
Right.
I'm fascinated that you're writing a series with your brother. What fun that must be.
Yeah.
So what are the challenges for that, especially with a family member? I assume you get along with this family member, so.
Right. Yeah, we were wondering about that. And he has, like JW, he has a very active home life. He's got 6-year-old twins and a full-time job. So it's, the challenge is kind of like, okay, how do we make this like go and everything? So and we weren't sure how it would be in terms of, well, I was basically really worried about how he would take feedback, because
Sure.
as we all know, it's kind of like a thing, everybody takes it differently. Some people really want it, some people don't. And some people like evolve to become more used to it. So far, so good in that regard. But we'll just kind of have to see how we go through it. But our basic process is, like, we talked about this story idea, and it's a mystery series. And we think similarly in terms of like humor and characters. And we wanted to do a very character-driven mystery series. So he's like drafting it because he likes the drafting part. And then I'm going back in through and like adding more details and more things like that. So it's been really pretty interesting and fun. And he joined me at 20 books. So it was just really great to have that experience of talking about, like, we go to different talks and then, what did you learn there and things like that. So we're trying to do a bunch of them ahead because we want them to have like the similar tone and things like that, and then figure out how to go about the whole release schedule.
So when you're doing your own writing, Jennifer, are, the details something you include in that initial draft normally, or is this very different from your own way that you would normally write just on your own?
Oh my gosh, I do not. I am like the world's shortest writer. It's very hard for me to do details on the first draft. I actually almost always do, if I'm just writing a story myself, it'll be, the first draft can be largely dialogue because that's what I hear or what comes to me when I'm working. And then I have to like go back and like think about all the other little things of like, where are they? What's happening? Those, what are the changes that are occurring? So it's really interesting just how different everybody's brain works with the storytelling. And I think the important thing is that, to just kind of, for a long time, I thought I was not a real writer because I did not sit down and start at chapter 1 and go to the end. I would like bounce around, and sometimes, especially if it had like a thriller element, I would start at the end and work backwards. And it was just, I just thought that was, me and not a, it just made me not a real writer. And then I love the mystery author, the British mystery author, Kate Atkinson. I don't know if you guys have heard her stuff. She came to speak near us, and I went to hear her. And I'm sitting there in the audience, and I asked her how she worked. She does the same thing. She moves all over. She writes dialogue. She talked about kind of almost as a loop of like, she'll write one version of the story, then she goes in and she does another layer. And it was just really awesome to hear that from her. And I'm like, oh, I love her stuff. So it was pretty great.
Well, I can tell you that. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I hate writing description. That's the thing I really have to work hard on and pull out. And, some people write the long first draft and have to cut. It's almost, I'm like you, first draft is always like, okay, now you got to add stuff.
Yeah.
And it's easy for imposter syndrome to settle on your shoulders, and it's not valid. There's as many different ways to go about this as there are people.
Yep. Very true. Yeah, those people who are like, oh yeah, I wrote a 100,000 word draft, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, my first draft almost always of whatever kind of book, 20,000 words.
Yeah. Yeah. 100,000. Who are you? Yeah.
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 Well, mine usually, well, I'll say first, the fourth novel that I'm finishing is the only one that I have written like entirely chronologically.
Oh.
The rest of them have been all over the place. Like my third novel, Forging Bonds, finished a trilogy. And when I started it, I really only had a good feel for one of the two main characters, and they were not together. They were in separate places. So I wrote like 7 of the female main characters' chapters that were going to be spread out all over the book, but I needed to know the timeline for them before I could figure out everything else. So I wrote her chapters first and then went back and wrote the other like 30 something chapters.
Mhm.
But
Mm.
this one is that I'm working on now is it's first person perspective. It is not a book that I thought, it's not what I thought I was going to write next. And I didn't really have a feel for it and just kind of started writing it and then plotting ahead as I went.
Mhm.
And it's the only one that I've written just entirely from chapter 1 to chapter 49.
Oh wow.
And then I will say too that my books end up being roughly the same length, at least so far when I'm done with it.
Hmm.
But that's only because I'm both going in and adding a bunch of things, and it's turned out that I've cut a similar
Right.
amount of things, and they've
Yes.
all ended up in similar links to where they started.
Mhm.
They are certainly much cleaner and neater when they're done. But the thing that I have to go back and add more of is emotional depth.
Mhm. Mhm.
As I'm writing, I
Mhm.
am trying to be conscious of, like when I'm writing in the first draft, I'm trying to be conscious of what I'm seeing and hearing and smelling.
Mhm.
Um, and mine have a lot of dialogue, but it's that emotional component that
Mhm.
I need to go back and be aware of because that is also true in my own life that I am not, that's not always at the front of my mind. And so that's borne out in my writing as well.
Mhm. I think we all have like things that come more naturally and things that we have to work with. And something like the emotional component is like, I think really important that you could layer in later. So I think, yeah, that, your way of working now and then, and not, beating yourself up about it and whatever, and just like even making a note, like I need more connection here or something, because yeah, you can do that and things will come to you. It's just, you can't do everything at once. And I think, or at least I've not yet met someone who can do everything at once. And so I think it's like whatever helps you get the words on the page and move the story along.
Yeah,
I
I
heard,
agree. And I
oh,
think like if you are trying to think, I have to do all of these things at the same time, you're going to bind yourself up and keep yourself
mhm,
from writing. And you
Yes.
can't edit what never hits the page.
exactly, exactly.
I
Yeah.
and I do what you suggest. Sometimes I'll write, more. I'll just put a little bracket
Right.
more so that when I'm going through later, because sometimes you just need to keep moving on and
Yeah.
getting that plot arc, at least getting the big pieces down. And the
Mhm.
people who just keep editing the same little, snippet of writing every day until it's perfect, that's fine, but they never get the whole book done. And so it's hard sometimes to say, all right, that's for later. I got to keep going.
Right. I totally agree. One thing that I have that I had trouble with, and I heard Charlene Harris, it's nice to live in Seattle because at least pre-pandemic, a lot of people would come through here and you could go hear them talk. But I've always found it hard to transition between chapters, like how to, like, I know that you need to set up a good hook, but then how does that, and I kind of like to do that part, but then like starting off the next chapter, it'd always be like a little like, how do I do that? And so it was interesting to hear her say that she called that connective tissue and those transitions between chapters, and said she just hates it. and she saves it all till the end because it's this. And so it's like really interesting, just like all the different ways people work.
And I can see the merit to that because your connective tissue, you don't want every chapter to have the same sounding connective tissue. And if you're writing it all at once across your book, you're going to solve that problem from the get-go.
That's something that I guess, I mean, I'm still early in my fiction writing, but I have, I've got 4 that I've completed. Before that, I had 2 that haven't been finished. And one of the things that got me hung up early on was thinking that, I guess my novels have tended to stretch out over a 3-4 week period. This one is over 7 weeks. And realizing that all of these moments don't have to touch each other.
Correct.
And like the the ideas need to carry over, and the events need to carry over, but it's okay. Nobody needs to be brushing their teeth, unless somebody's getting shot while they're brushing their teeth, or or whatever. Like you don't have to put in, and you shouldn't put in all the mundane things that don't have any bearing on anything. And that was really hard early on to figure out what I can just end the chapter with and where to pick up the next one. And eventually I came to the idea of like, well, I'll just pick up the next one where the next thing happens in the story.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that reminds me a little bit of the show don't tell advice, which is always good, always good. But at some point, you can't show everything. Sometimes you got, if it's an important fact and it's not interesting, just tell the reader the fireman got to the house, not the red truck pulled up and people with, reflective gear and big boots. And that's the writer's craft, is deciding what's interesting and what's not.
There was a podcast I listened to last week, and now I'm going to have to pull it up here because I don't want to get it wrong. Of course, it's not pulling up in my feed. It's Fiction Writing Made Easy by Savannah Gilbo. And she was talking about what to summarize just to move it along. And she used some really good illustrations out of Harry Potter, where like there's this whole, couple hundred word section, or maybe even more, of like what happened over winter break. And she just summarized, J.K. Rowling just summarized the main things that happened over winter break and moved on so she could set up the next thing that happened in the story. And sometimes you don't have to get into all the weeds about everything. And that's part of that connective tissue too.
Yeah.
All right. So going back to tropes, Jennifer, how do we have tropes without ending up in cliches?
Oops, I think I lost you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Now I can, yes.
Okay.
What was the question?
How do we have our tropes that are necessary, but keep them fresh so that they don't become cliches?
Yeah. So, excuse me. One of the things I worked on is using goal, motivation, and conflict to develop the tropes in our stories. And I found that's really helpful because it gives so I'll kind of seesaw back and forth when I'm in working with the story with using the tropes and the goal, motivation, conflict for them. So is there a favorite show that one of you guys has I could use as an example, or something from TV or movie, or as long
I
that
have
people
just
would generally
finished.
know?
Well, I'm about to finish my 9-season rewatch of Seinfeld. I don't know if that still lands with people or not, but there's a whole lot of conflict in there.
There is, and there are tons of tropes in there too. I was trying to think of something that was more kind of like complete we could talk about, or have either of you guys seen Justified?
Yeah.
Oh,
love
yeah.
Justified.
Oh my gosh,
Justified, yeah.
Oh, it's so great. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I'll talk about them in relation to that. Okay. So there's just so much I love about that. But first of all, Boyd and Raylan are just like the two best characters ever. And I just loved all, like, so if we think about Raylan, he's the detective slash marshal. There's like, he has to return to his hometown. And he's not happy about that. And then there's, I'm just going to list some of the tropes as what I'm thinking of them. And then there's like redemption, and then there's reunion, redemption because he's trying to get out of there from his screw ups and get back to Miami. There's reunion slash second chance because he meets up with his ex-wife. I'm trying to think of other stuff. There's, well, definitely protector with the FBI. So, I mean, there's just so much in there. His boss is just a great character. And then all his, family members, and then the Boyd, the character who he's trying to investigate is his former best friend, who's or somebody who saved his life. They grew up very similarly, and then their paths diverged. He went to FBI, and the other guy went for crime. And but yet, so even though we know that Boyd's a criminal and he starts out being very racist and just, oh my gosh, he's just a fantastic character to watch him evolve. But then he has all these other parts of him that make him change. He's very dedicated to, family, and he's really, he falls in love with the blonde woman whose name I can't remember. And really he's always trying to like make things right with her and have that go. And he's always trying to like prove himself. And there's times he saves Raylan's life. So it's like, there's just all of these tropes in there of like jealousy because they both like the same girl at one time. And I think it's just pretty fantastic because they develop them very specifically. So I'll just take one. So Raylan, his goal is he wants to get out of, he's in Lexington, Kentucky, I believe, and he wants to get back to Miami. So that's his goal. And what I like about it is a super clear goal. We know from the get-go that's his goal for the whole series is he wants to get out of Kentucky, and he also is his job is to catch Boyd. So those two things are going to go through that 4 seasons. And then that's his goal. Then the motivation is justice for him, or that it's his duty. He's very kind of focused on that. And then, but the conflict, which is awesome, is that, this guy saved his life, and he, sending him to jail when he did that thing so long ago is like always a conflict for him, that he always pulls back from actually killing him when he does have many chances to do it. So the whole thing I think that makes tropes really work, developing them with goal, motivation, and conflict, is you want to have the conflict and the goal really working against each other. They have similar things, but it gives you just a lot to push back, because the whole point of storytelling, as we know, is really conflict. Like Barb was saying, we can't just read like pages and pages of description with nothing happening. We have to have things move along. That's what a story is. So I could fangirl about that show all day, but I just think those writers did a terrific job of creating characters using tropes, but yet it felt so fresh. And yeah, I don't know. But you guys, I have something to say. What do
No,
you
I
guys
think
think?
that's perfect. And
Wonderful.
Boyd Crowder is my favorite villain
I know.
of any
Yes.
show.
Oh, he's so
Yeah.
good. I
Yeah.
know.
And he's awful and cruel, and you
Yeah.
root for him because you
Yes.
see the good guy that he wants to be.
Yes.
Yeah.
So true. I
And
just love, yeah.
there's the tension of he and Raylan are not that different.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
so
exactly.
many of their motivations are the same.
Mhm.
And it is like this thin gray line of the law that
Mhm.
separates them.
Mhm.
And there's plenty of times when they're not on the correct side of the law that they're supposed to be on too. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
so I think that's a great
Yeah.
example.
And the other villains, the Kathy Bates, who won the Emmy for being
Yes.
the poisoner,
Yep.
Mama,
Oh yeah.
brilliant character.
Oh shoot. She was just fantastic. I know.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Well, I
the
think
guy who was the Duffy, the guy
yes.
who lived in the truck.
Yes.
or not the truck, the motorhome. I mean, that was really fascinating. Like, he's this whole ruthless character, and then yet you saw this whole other side of him with his like assistant slash boyfriend. And it was just like unexpected, and yet you're like, oh yeah,
Well, and one of the things that I really appreciated about that show was they kept the stakes appropriate from season to season. Whereas like there's other shows that I've watched over the years, like Sons of Anarchy, at some point gets into like you go from this motorcycle gang in California to they're involved with the CIA and the remnants of the IRA, and it just gets way out of proportion, and you have to rein it back in. But in Justified, it kept it all within the scope of this Eastern Kentucky Dixie Mafia crime world. And, it gets into other states and all that, but it just all felt appropriate for the story they were telling.
Yeah, definitely. I never understood that kind of concept of how, I think they say holler, like the holler, and how that was so much of the forced proximity. I mean, you were just in those places, and that sense of you weren't getting out. And I loved all the times that Raylan committed crimes, but he didn't.
Yeah.
He justified that, and his, I pulled first. What a great, like, or he pulled first. I'm sorry, was his kind of reason for everything, and it said a lot about who he was. So anyway, so that was just
pull it back out and watch it again.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that first, first season is just so fantastic how they set it up. And so I think that's a really good example of a show that used tropes. And there's all kinds of, action tropes in there, but they were developed so specifically that I don't ever watch that show and think, oh yeah, another trope, which I have to say a lot of like the network shows I can't really watch because it's just like, oh, the tropes are so not developed, so, but people will, everybody has their own taste, but there's some really good stuff out there of how people have developed, people develop and use tropes. I was going to one other pitch for a good mystery thriller is Slow Horses on Apple TV.
Love it.
Oh, that one also.
Writing is brilliant.
Yeah. You have to get Apple TV for a little while, JW, to watch it.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you don't have it.
You will love it. You and your wife will love it.
All right, we'll check it out. We're on the hunt for something else to watch
now.
So
it's like the B team of MI5 agents. The ones who are disgraced and stuff, they're in one, they're kind of sent to a satellite site, and the characters in it are just so well done. It's really great.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is a great, like, practical place to bring this to a close. But before we do, Jennifer, I want you to make sure to tell people where to find you and your work, and so they can get these books that can be extraordinarily helpful in their own writing practice.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you can just check out my website. My books are available wide, but you can just learn more about me at www.jenniferhilt.com. And thanks so much for having me, you guys. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, I really enjoyed it.
Hilt, Hilt, right?
Correct. Yes, thank you.
Everybody gets the right website. Yeah. You've been great.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, super fun.